Welcome to part 2 where we're going to talk about the board. So I'm sure a few of you might think, okay, I got my core idea, when can I start drawing? And my answer is not right now. First, we have to go through the board, also known as the mind board and the design board. The board is pretty much a way to list down everything you need to know about your project. And the main information you want to ensure are who is it about, where is it happening, when is it happening, and why it's going on. And so your job in this board is just to kind of figure it out exactly who's going to be your character and when the action is taking place and why is this action taking place. So between you and me, I already have a good idea of what I would like the project to look like, but for the sake of the video and to help you, I am going to lay down as many options as possible in this board so you can understand like how you could apply this to your own project in the future. So first of all, we're gonna answer the question, who is this about? Like, yeah, it's about pig people. That's pretty straightforward. And we might all have an idea like, well, of course, it's pig people. This is how I picture it into my mind. But you'd be quite surprised at how the same idea and the same word can appear in the mind of people in very different way. Here, for example, we could have two options. For example, the first option is we could have pig people, which is anthropomorphic pig character. We need to have like some suit in order to go underwater. And the second option is like, what if we had pig people who evolved somehow to be able to live underwater? We're gonna call them merpig. No one is questioning this. So, okay, cool. So we can see we have two options here. Now, what about where? And I can hear some people saying like, duh, it's underwater. That's pretty simple. Is it though? Underwater could be under the ocean. Could be also under the sea. What about under a river? What about under a lake? What about a swamp or some wetland? It really could be anywhere. Do not just stop at like your first thought. Try to explore as many options as you can because that will trigger even more creativity and that's gonna make also your project more interesting and more unique. Now you might think, okay, cool, we have a fair amount of option here, but what if I tell you we can make it worse? For example, when we talk about the sea, again, you might have a very clear idea of like, well, this is how the sea looks like. Of course, this is what everybody think about when they think about sea. But I can't assure you that the way I'm going to think about sea or like the sea I'm going to picture in my head as someone who is from south of France is going to be very different from like what someone else that is from, let's say, Indonesia might picture in their head when they think about the seaside. Just because the fauna and the flora, so the creature and the plants living in this water, it's just going to be very different from each other. So I had as an example here the Caribbean Sea, which is a tropical climate, versus the Baltic Sea, that is a continental climate. One is going to be with like in a warm environment. The other one is taking place in a colder environment. So clearly animals, vegetation, and everything that lives inside that sea is going to be very, very different from another one. Another example, you might think about swamp and wetland, and maybe we all have a vision of like what it would look like, but I can guarantee you that the wetland from Botswana gonna look very different from the bayou in the US. So you see, you might think about like underwater is very simple and straightforward, but now you have more option because you want to see like, okay, what kind of underwater we're talking about. Is it an ocean, a sea, a river, a lake, etc.? And then within this option, we have even more option. So again, I already have a clear idea in my head of like where I would like my project to take place. But I thought for educational purpose, it's still interesting to list all these options because sometimes, well, I don't know. I might look at this option and think like, you know what? The Okavango swamp in Botswana looks pretty cool. That would be really nice to have something set up there. It's also a very good way for you to look at all these options and realize that because those environments are very different from a place to another one, you realize that it's going to be incredibly important for you to look at proper reference when you're working on a project. So we have our option for the people, we have the option for where we would like the project to take place. what about when? So again, it's kind of straightforward. It should either take place in the past, in the present, or in the future. But as you can see from the previous example, well, what past or what future are we talking about? Let's start with the past. So that's where I personally start to do a lot of research about the history of submarine, or when did we start about thinking as human to like that would be cool to live underwater. So when you start doing your research as well, it's when you can start to decide for yourself like how realistic or how crazy you want your project to be. So if you want your project to be realistic, you will not be able to have it occurring during the 20th century, for example, because the technology would just not let you allow you to have a whole city underwater built with the technology of that time period. So if I wanted to have that project more realish, I would do all this research about scientific research that have been done now. And that's when I started to see about all those cool projects that were done from the 60s onward. For example, the Man in the Sea experience in 1962, which was one of the first submersible housing. That's hard to say, sorry about that. What about the project of Precontinent 1, 2, and 3 done by Cousteau that was around that same time period? So when you're doing the research and you realize like, oh, this thing were done in the past, you can look at this thing online and you can kind of study the shape they're using, the color they're using, the design language of those housing and of those vehicle or submersible props, and use that as a reference to design all the architecture or all the outfit of your character for your project. And as I did like more and more research, I realized there were so many of these underwater projects that look really, really cool. And as I did more research, that's when I start to see this name of Jacques Rougerie, who called himself a sea architect. And I'm gonna talk again, I'm gonna get back to that person again later on, but he made some incredible design and architecture that I really encourage you, like even if you have no interest about underwater theme stuff, I really encourage you to go and check his work because it's incredibly interesting. So I kind of like list down all those projects per year, because then after knowing the year it was done also like give me a better idea of like, okay, I can have like my underwater infrastructure, the overall look, the outside look to look like what these people have been doing at that time. But the inside of it, I can go a bit more crazy with the decoration and just look at like, well, what was like the go-to style for like an indoor kitchen in the 1960s? It could have like some very fun element to it as well. Or also thinking about like how the character, if they have hair, how would they style their hair knowing like they're from the 60s, etc, etc. So as you can see, I made some extended research about that. Of course, you need to do your research, but you don't need to push your research as much as I did. I took pretty much 2 days to do all of the research, and that's really because, well, I have the luxury, I have the time to be able to do this right now. If you are working on the portfolio, maybe you have work, maybe you have family duty, maybe you have school you need to attend, so you might not have as much time. I also just get very carried away whenever I do research, so I might not be the best reference for that. So that was like for like really stuff. You look at existing technology and projects that were done in the past, and you can use this as a reference to do your own portfolio. Now, if you want to have it a little bit more crazy or a little bit more fantasy, you can go further away in the past. So, for example, I remember like there were like this book from Jules Verne called 20,000 Leagues Under the Ocean that was written in 1870. And you could actually use the whole vibe of that book to go for a steampunk look and just use the design language of that time period, using all like the steam technology and stuff like that to try to design a city underwater. That would add a new layer of difficulty to your portfolio though, because you're gonna have to like not just figure out big people, but also living underwater and living underwater with just like steampunk technology. So that can be a bit overwhelming. So if you're more advanced, it's fine, just go for it. It would be very fun. If you're a beginner, I would recommend you to have something that is a bit more grounded into the technology you could see on a daily basis. So yeah, you can use like all as this reference, including like the first design of the first like suit to go underwater that look like pretty cool as well. And when I was doing some research, I realized like the first design for a submarine was done in the 16th century. That's pretty awesome. So you could also have your project based during that time period and see like how like using that technology of the time, how would you actually figure out a submarine or like an underwater house. So for the medieval time, I will tell you later on how I would hook that up into the project. All right, so I think we cover up enough of the past. What about we want the project to take place in the present? So that's very straightforward. You just, as before, do some research about what is the current technology that is available and how you could use this for your project. And so I found like a bunch of like name of project, a lot of hotel. You got the Hydropolis Hotel that got cancelled, the Water Discus Hotel. So you get like a few project like hotel. Some of them got cancelled, some of them are still ongoing. And I'm gonna get back again to the sea architect Jacques Rougerie, who is doing so much for the topic we are covering up with this project. So a lot of the research I have now are really like oriented toward scientific stuff. But you need to think about like what are the other activities that are linked to water or underwater environment. And for example, you can think about nowadays how we are using technology to create like farms, aquaculture, and all the project like this. Now we got the present. Let's go into the future. So about the future, when we talk about a project can be set in the future, we meant it could be set in the future like 5 years from now, or it could be like 1,000 years from now, or even more. So to help you out, you can look at like incoming project, for example, the Sea Space Underwater Lab. That looks pretty interesting. There is some photo and there is some like a design available on the internet. The Sea Orbiter. And my favorite one is the Ocean Spiral, which is a design of an entire city underwater in a bowl that goes up and down a spiral. It's a Japanese project, I believe so. And if you have time, I really encourage you to go and check out some video on YouTube because it looks crazy and it is pretty cool. So you can look at like incoming project to see like how it would potentially look like. But while doing the research, I realized that a lot of the laboratory that were underwater were used also for space training. So as a result, you don't have to really just stop yourself to look at like submersible housing or vehicle. You can also look at space things now. And you can use that as a way to incorporate some more cooler or interesting design in your project by looking more at what are the vehicles or the props that is used into space. We have our option for who, where, and when. Now let's see our option for what and why. I think by now you got the idea. Like there is option, and within this option there is more option. So for this one, I'm just gonna be very straightforward with what possible activity could have lead our character to decide to go underwater. The first one would be collecting resource. Let's say there is a specific seaweed or specific rocks that they need, and they will just go and move underwater to collect that thing. Second option would be scientific research. As I was doing my research, I realized like a lot of what is pushing people to go underwater is to do scientific research. So I could just apply that for my own project as well. And the last option would be survival. You could have your project set in an environment where living above the water has become impossible for the creature, and therefore they had to move underwater in order to survive. That could be a possibility too. So we have all these options now for our project. Who? Pig or merpig? Where? Ocean, sea, river, lake, swamp. When? Past, present, future. What and why? Resource, survival, and science. So about the board, I've seen some people representing like this as well. There is no specific way for you to do a board or design board or mind board. Whatever works the best for you, just go for it. There is no like strict way of doing this. It's not like you get your core idea, then you can move on to your board, then you can move to your research, then you can move to your reference, and then finally you can sketch and design. There are gonna be a lot of back and forth between all those steps in your project. Having a core idea and a design board are really here to help you to keep focus on what's important in your project, and they're also here to help you to make a decision.